Kingdom CLAUS. Book 2. Of War and Snow. By Adam David Brown. Chapter 3. A Hidden Place of Torment. In a dark, stone room, somewhere in a black fortress, an old woman lay upon a dirty, straw-lined floor. She was chained to the wall, with an iron brace locked around her neck. She wore brown feather-trimmed robes that were now tattered and torn. Her face was dirty and bruised, her hands were covered in small cuts. This was Shula, wise shaman of Groddo Bearsbane, and she now was a captive of Amaranth. She suddenly sits up, awakened from a restless sleep filled with terrible dreams. She had no idea what time it was or even what day. She had no way of knowing, but she had been in this dreadful place for a few days now. Unbeknownst to her, she was imprisoned in an enemy stronghold somewhere just below the southern ridge of the Free Mountains. And this place would be unknown to anyone, for it was concealed by a fell spell. Truly a testimony to the remarkable power of the vile Kester. As the forward attacks upon the southern border of CLAUS went on these past several years, a secret battalion of Amaranth had been busy constructing a fortress, shadowed by evil and unseen by anyone. The same fell magic that cloaked this dark fortress also made the Gordovalian boot prints disappear from the southern road, making the night raids upon Groddo's village impossible to avenge. The shadow men would come in the night and leave no trace of their movement behind. There in this foul place, Shula sat, chained to the wall, behind iron bars. Upon the stone walls, hung pokers and prodders, prongs and pliers, and dimly lit torches that only played against the shadows. In one of the corners, sat a brazier filled with glowing red coals, that looked like impish eyes staring out into the hellscape. Buried in the coals were iron pokers and long, black spikes. There was no doubt as to their purpose, they were to be implements to extract information. They were there for torture, and this was a hidden place of torment. Across the room and adjacent to her cell was an iron door. Beyond that, she could hear the faint grumbling and mumbling of the shadow men going about their work. She didn't care what they were up to, so long as they didn't open that door and come to torment her anymore. So far, her terrible stay there has involved questions upon questions asked by the shadow men with fell voices that did not seem to be their own. The previous night, or day, Shula did not know, had concluded with a hot poker against her right arm. A dead-eyed soldier pressed it against her flesh as a tall and broad man asked her questions about the mountain road. Where does it lead? How far from Wolfblood does the cave lay? The man would ask, as the flesh of her arm seared upon the hot iron. But she said not a word. She didn't know it, but the man that questioned her was Borrow, once a proud captain of CLAUS in command of the 1st Garrison. He had long since been taken by the shadow and was now a horrid, yellow-eyed beast in the service of Amaranth and a puppet of Kester. Borrow was now the captain of this rotten place, commanding the shadow men under the sway of Kester. Shula had stalwartly refused to give any answers, and she would most certainly not betray her people. All of the torture and interrogation had done nothing but give Shula a sore arm and raise the frustration of her captors. She knew what they were asking about, but wondered why they wanted to know. No one had ever asked about that in all of her time on the earth, nor had she ever heard of anyone asking about it through all of existence. She knew her captors were asking about something that had not been a subject of interest in eras upon eras, ages upon ages. They were asking about the elm stave. Shula knew of this ancient thing, but had never seen it and, to her reckoning, only knew that it was sealed within a cave, many leagues northwest of Erman's village. She knew of it, but didn't exactly know what it was, for its meaning had been lost to time. It would seem that the secrets of the elm stave were things that only stone could tell. Shula didn't know it, but the elm stave was a slab of elm wood, and upon it was carved runes and symbols that no Northman or Vendigum that lived now knew the meaning of. It was made by wise men in an older than ancient time and was held in high regard for eras. Whatever the runes upon the slab were, they had been deemed sacred, and the elm stave was hidden away in a cave, to never see sunlight again. The knowledge of this place and what was inside had been passed down through the ages, and Erman's bloodline had long been in charge of protecting its secrets. The cave, and the forest it lay within, were held as hallowed, and entrance to this place was forbidden. Shula knew of the elm stave and where it was, but that was the extent of her knowledge. Perhaps the other shaman knew more, but she did not. She had supposed that Father Frost knew about it, but would have been surprised to know that he didn't. As it was, he only knew murmurs of it and basically knew what Shula knew. She then supposed that the vile Kester knew about it and shuddered at the notion of that. She didn't know what the elm stave was used for, but knew for a man of fell magic such as Kester was, to seek it, it had to have a terrible purpose. She had never met Kester, nor has she ever seen him, but had heard many rumors. She knew enough about his power that she figured all that has happened to her and her village had been his doing. She then surmised that it would only be a matter of time before she would be face to face with this dark magician. The torture and questioning had failed to achieve their purpose, but surely Kester would have ways to get what he wanted. Moment upon moment passed as Shula sat there upon the straw floor, her arm seething in pain and her mind racing. Then, to her dismay, the iron door clanked and slowly opened. There in the dark doorway stood Groddo. His eyes had become so yellow from the festering poison words that were within him that they almost glowed in the dark. His skin had long since turned grey and he looked a truly horrible sight, as if he were a corpse waiting for an empty grave. He walked slowly into the chamber and picked up one of the pokers in the brazier. "Let's try again," he said in a voice that was almost only an echo. It was then that a soldier rushed into the doorway and announced, "The black carriage has come." Groddo threw the poker back into the brazier and coals tumbled about and embers flickered in the darkness. He then turned and walked from the chamber, slamming the iron door behind him. Shula sat there in silence for what seemed like hours. She could hear mumbles and grumbles from outside the door. They got closer and louder and then there was a clank upon the iron door and it once again slowly opened. In walked two shadow men holding torches, then came Groddo, who stood for a moment and turned to reveal a tall and slender man in black clothes and a long, dark grey coat. Affixed to the coat's shoulders were tufts of black fur, that sat like plates of armor. Upon his head was a round wide-brimmed black hat and upon his lanky fingers were gold rings, 2 on one hand and 3 on the other. His air reeked of evil and his long greasy black hair hung down each side of his narrow head. The vile man that now stood grinning at Shula was Kester, wicked wind upon the north. He slithered closer to her and hissed. "Such poor accommodations for such an esteemed houseguest. I'm told that you've not been playing our little game. It seems as though you've left your manners back in your little village. Let's see if your mind will tell me what your tongue refuses to." Kester then turned to Groddo and said, "Bring her to my chamber within the hour." Groddo said nothing, only bowing his head in response. Kester turned and slinked back through the door. Groddo and the two soldiers followed and slammed the iron door behind them. Shula once again sat in silence, wondering what her fate would be. She was old, very old, and had spent her long life as the keeper of knowledge and ancient wisdom. She thought it was such a shame to have her time on this earth end here in this dark and fell place. Whatever Kester had planned, she was determined to tell him nothing, for it was certain that he would have her executed whether she talked or not. Amaranth's forces did not often take prisoners; when they did not keep them long. She strayed in her thoughts and wondered where exactly she was. Could she be somewhere in Groddo? In Amaranth's very castle perhaps? If only she knew that she was so close to home. It may have given her some comfort in knowing that a rescue was entirely possible, but she didn't know this. She was trapped in some foul dungeon of some awful place, is all she knew. At the edge of the hour, the iron door slowly opened yet again. 2 shadow men came in and swiftly opened the cage, unlocked her chains, and dragged Shula through the chamber and down a dark, dimly lit hallway. She yelled aloud as one of the soldiers squeezed the fresh burn wound on her arm. The hallway seemed to go on forever as she was dragged and pulled until they came to its end, and there, a black iron door stood like a grim reaper. The door swung open inwards, seemingly on its own, and within the room beyond, sat Kester upon a gnarled, black throne. It was twisted and wicked, much like he who sat upon it. The soldiers dragged Shula inside and threw her to the floor. Kester looked upon her, then raised his head and said, "Come now. Is that any way to treat our guest?" The 2 soldiers simply stood there with blank faces, waiting for their next command. "That will be all, for now," Kester said, waving his hand. The soldiers slowly walked out of the chamber and the door closed on its own. Shula rose to her feet and looked about the room. There were torches mounted to the stone walls and lit candles atop tables and altars. There melted wax forming cocoons around their housings. Upon one of the wooden tables sat a bottle of red wine and 2 goblets. Kester rose, walked over and poured some wine into both goblets. Taking one goblet for himself and handing the other to Shula, he said, "There's no need for such poor manners, my dear. You are my guest. Let us drink to the world's ending. Surely you have seen it. You're a shaman, after all. You know of this fate, don't you?" Kester handed one of the goblets to Shula. She had no recollection of what he was talking about. She had never been told of the world's end, nor did she know of its fate. She said nothing. She took the goblet and tolerated his poison words. Kester continued. "You and I are very much the same. We are cut from the same cloth. We are both of magic ilk and can see things the insects upon the north cannot. We are visionaries. We sit on the edge of a new world, a new time. A world without these slobbering ironsuckers. I seek to rid the world of its lamprey, and you have a chance to come with me." Kester then drank from his goblet as Shula replied. "A new time? This time exists as it is. It is only ruined by your perversions, snake of a man. A new world? Bah! The arrogance to think a slithering bastard like you could change what has stood for ages. The same we are not. I tell you. I am the keeper of ancient things, a teacher, a healer. I create, you only destroy." Her voice was weak and dusty. She then threw the wine in Kester's face. It seemed to dry immediately as he said, "Once the world is crippled in a frozen mass, you will wish you stood beside me and not against me. An amaranth shall laugh at this notion of such insolent heroism. 'Tis truly a pity that I must now carve open your mind like a roasted game bird." The gold rings upon his fingers began to glow and his eyes turned white as he grabbed Shula by the head. There was a sizzling sound as he pressed ever harder, like he was squeezing the very thoughts from her mind. His hands began to glow red as Shula could do nothing but gasp. Kester was absorbing her thoughts and knowledge and wisdom, stealing what was once thought to be untouchable. The sizzling grew to what sounded like a roaring fire as Kester's entire body now burned with a bright red shadow. In her mind, Shula could see everything that Kester was stealing and she could do nothing to stop him. Finally, satisfied with what he had taken, Kester released her and she fell to the floor. She lay there, barely breathing and far too weak to say anything. Kester now knew what she knew and there was no going back. "There, now. Was that so difficult?" he said as he looked down at her. He hissed as he continued. "My spy was only able to show me where Erman Wolfblood's village was, but, alas, not what it guarded. And you, my dear, have shown me more than I could ever hope to know. I had known for some time now that your savage people knew where the elm stave was, and it was only a matter of time before I knew as well. To think, such dirty vagrants held something so powerful. What's more is that you didn't even know what it was. How amusing. Don't worry, Mum, when the boot of amaranth is upon the neck of Wolfblood, I shall tell your people that you didn't say a word. And as your mountains burn, you may yet live to see the frozen apocalypse that will lay before you." Shula began to sob softly as she lay there, for it was all she had the strength to do. She had listened to what Kester had said and an immense dread came over her. She had been the keeper of knowledge about things she didn't fully understand, and as it was clear to her now, things that were far more powerful than she could have guessed. The very same things that Kester had always known more than her about, and now his knowledge of it was even greater. She gained some strength, lifted her head and asked, What have you done?" Kester took a long gulp from his goblet and said, "My dear woman, you have given me a precious gift. I now know what you know. You would not tell us, so I simply took it. Aha, the forbidden forest. So, that's where it is kept. How quaint." Shula mustered as much strength as she could, and shouted, "That is a sacred place. Swine like you will never step foot within it." Kester drank another gulp and laughed as he said, "I'm sure it is. And I shall keep that in mind when we rampage through the village like rabid dogs. I'm certain that your swill-drinking folk shall remind me of such as they drown on their own blood. Come now, this was also unnecessary. You could have told us and it would have been far more easier on you. Yet, here you lay, half dead and weeping at my feet." All Shula could do in response was groan. Kester poured some more wine into his goblet and said, "Tell me, lady, do you even know what the elm stave is? Such strange doings of the world that would see ignorant peasants like you in charge of something so great and terrible. Fear not, my dear, your part in this is done. You have proven very useful, you should take pride in that. I'm quite finished with you now. You're cordially invited to rot here and watch the world's rebirth behind iron bars. I simply insist you accept." Kester took a long drink from his goblet and called forth Borrow. The door opened slowly and the horrid captain entered the chamber. He stood there like a morbid monolith, such a ghastly thing he has become. Kester turned to him and said, "I returned to Groddo this evening to tell our king the good news of this fine lady's cooperation. Make no movements north until I return to this place. Hold your command, captain." Kester then called for his guards and they dragged Shula out of the chamber and back to the dungeon. The day went on and she wondered what it was that would cause someone to go through so much trouble to obtain. She wondered too, of the extent of what's happened and what such stolen information would do. She was very weak and a fell sleep took her as she lay chained to the wall.